Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Steve Jewell with CommunityGiving, and we're delighted to have you with us here today. A beautiful day here in Minnesota in March. Temperature is continuing to go up, and it's been almost 1 year since we started staying at home, and that we started this series we've been calling Community Connections as a way to stay in touch with all of you and with the communities that we serve here at CommunityGiving. A lot of incredible people across our region doing great work, and really it's been especially important, I think, for all of us to stay in touch, even if it's just been virtual. And so we want to thank you for all of you who have tuned into any of these Community Connections webinars that we've done. All of them are recorded and are available on our website. So if you missed one or more, or just want to check what we talked about looking back over the course of the last year, please go to our website and you can find them there. We know that several of you today, if you have to step out, that's okay. You'll get an email with a copy of the recording later, so you certainly can watch it later. But thank you for tuning in and spending your time with us today. We think today is going to be especially a good topic and presentation, so we'll get to that in just a second, but just a couple of housekeeping that if you have some questions as we go through today's presentation, feel free to put those questions in the Q&A. Our speakers may answer those as they go, or we will definitely have a time at the end to have some Q&A and have your questions answered. Again, this series is just something we feel has been important to stay in touch. We had not done a webinar before we started this series, and so we've all learned as we've been going forward, and we've appreciated your patience, but more than anything, we've appreciated your ideas and your thoughts and different topics you think we should cover. So always feel free to email us. My email address is there, or email us at info@communitygiving.org, and we do appreciate your insights and your thoughts. And so without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our Executive Director of the Willmar Area Community Foundation and the Sauk Center Area Community Foundation, Sarah Carlson.
Thanks so much, Steve. Well, welcome everyone. We're awfully glad to see you again for our webinar series. And today's topic is rewriting the rural narrative. And we have two distinguished members who are going to be sharing their information from the University of Minnesota Extension Services. And they are also both they're researchers, they're educators, and they're leaders from within their communities here in central Minnesota. So Ben Winchester is a rural sociologist, and he has been working both in and for small towns across the Midwest for over 25 years. He lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota with his wife and his two children, and he is trained as a rural sociologist working as a senior research fellow for the University of Minnesota Extension's Center for Community Vitality. He conducts applied research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding a theme of rewriting the rural narrative that are vital to rural America. And his colleague, Neil Linscheid, is an extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. His work focuses on supporting local leaders as they navigate economic changes taking place in their community. His mission is to teach, coach, and connect local leaders as they try to make informed decisions about their community's economic future. Neil, his wife, and his children make their home in Sauk Center, and we are very pleased to share as well that Neil is a member of our Sauk Center Area Community Foundation Board, where his talents are deeply appreciated. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Ben to start our learning. Thank you, Ben and Neil.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Steve. Really my pleasure to be here today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on what we call rewriting the rural narrative. I work for University Extension, so does Neil, who you're going to hear from in just a little bit. I think many of you know Extension as the 4-H people. We're not in 4-H. We're in really what is I would argue, a newer sliver of Extension that, we don't have a ton of people. We have maybe 25 staff there, but we do research and education and training in with not a primary focus, but a goal of trying to address some of the changes that we've seen across rural Minnesota and our rural communities. Many of you may know Extension. We're here to help. We're here to bring out research, bring out knowledge from the University University of Minnesota to the countryside. So my life's work. I grew up in Winona, went to school in Morris, which when I went to school in Morris, I thought that was a small town. And I realized Morris is actually a pretty good sized city, with 5,000 people. That's 80% of the cities in Minnesota are smaller than Morris. So, when I start thinking and doing work in small towns, I started to realize early in my career that this narrative, how we use to describe our small towns is just terrible. And so I have really honestly made it my life's mission to find out all the ways in which rural America is not dying. And in fact, what we found is that the narrative being used to describe our small towns just patently is false. Like it may have been true 50 or 60 years ago, but we've got a lot of trends that have been happening right under our noses, under the radar, that lead us to believe that actually rural America is doing much better than before. We have a diversified economy, we have a diversified workforce. And I would say my biggest question to you all, if you do believe that rural America is dying, if you believe that, there's nothing left for our kids there to live, to return to or anything, then if rural America is dying, then why can't they find a house to buy? This is the real simple question. Like if we're dying, like there should be homes for sale all over literally in the countryside, but we don't have that. And why is that? It's because we have been very popular as a destination. So I'm going to start sharing a PowerPoint here, and you'll see the title of it here is Rewriting the Rural Narrative. And we're working on a concept here called resident recruitment. And this is really trying to better understand a complement to, you'll hear about this, Neil will talk about this a little more in depth, about a complement to industrial recruitment, right? Typically, economic development in our rural communities historically has been around industrial recruitment, meaning we bring a business and that business is going to allow us to hire a bunch of people that will be recruited to the community. Where what the concept we're going to talk about here today is resident recruitment. It starts with the person. It doesn't start with the job. But in order to better understand how to do resident recruitment, we need to better understand the dynamics of rural life. So you'll see the subtitle here is Living in the Middle of Everywhere. I like the play on this because it gets back to the narrative, right? The narrative is that we live in the middle of nowhere. Well, you're going to sell your rural place to people saying you live in the middle of nowhere, like some people do, like the isolationist piece. But at the same time, it also implies that there's literally nothing there. When I think when we start to think about where we live and where we shop and where we play, and we'll have an exercise for you here to take home later in the presentation. But it really is, we live in the middle of all of these aspects of our lives. So we'll talk about some of these pieces here. So I think more recently, the pandemic has brought new attention to rural communities, and we're starting to think this is new, right? Americans big on the idea of country living, the Heartlands revival, time to move. And so in a lot of ways, people are like, wow, this is going to be a real opportunity for rural America to finally not die, basically, right? Like to be a place that people want to go, as opposed to a place that people maybe don't want to go. Well, I want to remind you of where we were a year ago. And I kind of like the Star Wars thing, like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, like 1 year ago. There was a normal that we were talking about here in Extension. There was a normal that we would talk about in our presentations all the time. And it was that our rural communities were dying, but at this narrative around rural communities are around death and dying. But the reality of the data is showing people are moving in. So let's go through some of this. When I talk about the narrative, I talk about this. I talk about who is describing our rural communities and how do our rural communities get described. And it's mostly through national media, right? From Breadbasket to Basket Case. This was a national newspaper 2 summers ago that put a headline out from Breadbasket to Basket Case. Now, if you're a mental health professional, I hope you are offended by this headline. As a rural lover, I am offended by this headline. But this is part and parcel of where we are and how we describe our small towns. That this is a place gone by. It's a place that its best history is behind us. And in fact, we've got colleagues who write books, and we have books called Hollowing Out the Middle, and this talks about the rural brain drain. And for those of you that don't know, the rural brain drain is where our high school kids, when they graduate, some 40 to 60% of them choose to leave. And this is called the brain drain. Well, okay, and the implication here of this book is that when those kids leave, that there's nothing left, right? The town is hollowed out. Well, that may not be true. Actually, it's not. I don't want to give out a big spoiler here. It's not true. You don't just hollow out your towns. We have done a significant amount of research around that brain drain and how that looks in our rural communities. But we also have like the slow agonizing death. Rural is changing, though. Rural is certainly not dying. What we do know is that this narrative is fairly pervasive, that there's a brain drain. We live in the middle of nowhere. We're a sleepy town that was woken up by the blank, right? You see that in newspaper articles all the time. Like nobody's sleeping in your town until something happens, right? Everybody knows one another. Not true. Nobody locks their doors. That's not true. Right. So, there's all these kind of stereotypes that we have about rurality that tend to paint a picture of rural being a certain thing. Right. But in many ways, when you look at the narrative that we have in our communities, this narrative is based upon what we had, what we don't have, what we wish we had, what we could have had. Like, I can't tell you how many towns I go to that have this story, and this Morris had this too. Like, we could have had 3M in town if it weren't for the council, right? Like in the 60s or whatever it was, if they would have just rezoned that land north of the highway, then we could have had 3M. Well, 3M never looked at Morris, seriously. And they never looked at a lot of towns that these stories come from. But why do we have these stories in our communities about missed opportunities? I argue that a lot of times we have stories about missed opportunities because we don't believe we are where we should be. We don't believe the capacity, the ability, the capability of our community is really being tapped into. But what we do know is that rural communities have been growing. Since 1970, the rural population has not gone down, it's gone up. So here's some of the data, right? But what's gone down is the relative percentage. You can see my cursor there, right? 1970, 1 in 4 people, 26%, lived in a small town or a rural place. But by 2010, that went down to 1 in 5 people. And how can that be, right? How can rural populations go up, but the percentage of Americans living in rural places goes down? It's because while the rural growth rate was 11%, the urban growth rate was 50%. So even though the pie got bigger, the red part, the rural part of the pie here got bigger too, but it didn't get as big as fast as metropolitan America did. So ultimately, this leads to a reduction in the percentage of Americans that live in rural places. And many times that percentage is used to describe a general trend that people don't want to live in rural places anymore. People prefer urbanity is the implication when you see this percentage decline, but it's not true. In fact, 25% of all of our counties here in the United States have been reclassified from rural to urban. So, imagine the Twin Cities metro area. How many counties were they, 40, 50 years ago? It used to be the 7-county metro area, the 7-county metro. Well, how many counties does the metro have now? Like 14. Like, it's not that urban areas grow taller, they grow wider and they take over rural communities a lot of times. And then what happens, it looks like our rural community population went down when in fact it just was reclassified over to urbanity. So now we do have another kind of myth out there that the lucky few escape, right? Our kids leave and they need to get out because there's nothing here for them, right? That there's this brain drain. Well, in fact, 40 to 50% of our residents move every 5 years. That number has been depressed the past 3 years here, but probably 3 to 4 percentage points down. But overall, the point here is that we're a highly mobile population. And when we look at the differentials in who moves in and who moves out, like here's an example. It's from the 90s, but this was actually the very first chart I made. But this was the chart that I was like, okay, here are the differentials. If the bar goes to the right, that means that age group got bigger over the last 10 years. And if the bar goes to the left, that age group got smaller. Well, these 20 to 24-year-olds get smaller because kids graduate, right? 18 years old. Now they move up to be 20 to 24 years old from when they used to be 10 to 14. 43% of young people in Grant County left after graduation. But at the same time, I was like, wait a minute, it looks like there's people moving in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So meanwhile, here's the brain drain. Here are a number of books, hundreds of journal articles focused right here. And my point was, wait a minute. We've got people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s moving to this rural community. They're bringing their kids because those 10 to 14-year-old, the net increase in 10 to 14-year-olds doesn't happen because they migrate by themselves. They're moving with their parents. So now we have this kind of picture here of, well, on one hand, you have 30 to 60 or 40 to 60% of your young people moving out. There are enough people moving in to Grant County to make up for the loss of the young people to allow their population to remain stable. So now, what do we have? And if you want to, we'll get a link shared out with you to read more about this, but we call this trend the brain gain, because again, the negative narrative is around the brain drain, right? The kids are leaving, but meanwhile, we got people in their 30s and 40s that move in, sometimes in a lot of counties too, in the 50s and 60s, mostly the recreational counties, but almost no county is immune to preference, to people wanting to live there. Like people will be like, well, of course, everybody's moving to the lakes. No, people are moving to like Rock County too. Like people are moving to the prairie. They're moving to recreational places. They're moving to retirement places. Every place is desirable across the state. So when we ask people like, why did you make the move? And we just got done with the largest survey of newcomers ever done here in the country. The results are not official yet until we publish our final report, but we find more generally, it reaffirmed the findings we had earlier, which was these people who are newcomers, i.e. people who move in the past 5 years. When we ask them, why did you choose to move to this rural community? The top reasons people give are simpler pace of life, safety and security, and the low cost of housing. And when you, sorry, I swapped these slides out earlier. And when you look at kind of the factors as to why people, here's the whole sorted list. So also, don't feel like you need to scribble notes. We're going to make sure to get this PowerPoint out to you. So don't feel like you need to take a picture of this or anything. We'll certainly make sure to get this out to you. But when you look at the reasons why people give, like to take on a job, like when we think about how we recruit people to our communities, a lot of times our HR people in our employment sector are very much like, if people don't move here for a job, why would they move here? Well, this isn't 1920. I'll say that in 1920, we really did migrate to where the jobs were. But today it's called the chicken or egg of economic development. Do jobs bring people, or can people bring jobs? And it can be the egg or the chicken these days. Like in the 1920s, it was the egg. It was the egg that drew the chickens in. The jobs drew the people in. But today we know, and you all know this, that people can work from home. This is, I mean, these findings are pre-pandemic. I want to remind you that these are pre-pandemic. We had people choosing to move to our rural communities because they wanted basically decouple where they work from where they live. So when we talk about who these newcomers are as well, just 1/3, 31% of these new people that move to your rural communities have moved there primarily for a job, i.e. they had a job offer in hand, or they were invited by their company to relocate. Put the other way, 2/3 of people aren't moving just for a job. They're moving for all of those other reasons, right? All of those other factors that influence like recreation and open space and opportunity in schools for their kids, right? So when you start thinking through all of these different reasons that people make the move, we would be remiss if we did not try to address an economic development strategy that capitalized upon this, right? So now we also found out, the second piece I want to hit on here is that just 25% of rural newcomers had lived in that community before. Of these households, like anybody in the household had lived there before, right? It could have been husband and wife, or a single person with their kids. We thought this honestly was going to be much higher. We thought it was going to be around, 75% of people moving to our rural communities had grown up there and they moved away and they came back, right? And when we found out this data, it totally reevaluated our understanding of not only just the kind of work we could do, but how do we help these people? Because put yourselves into the shoes of a true newcomer, into a town of 300 people, and you don't know anybody. You didn't live there before. Who do you call if you have emergency daycare needs? Who do you call if your plumbing breaks at 1 a.m, right? I mean, it's scary enough moving, but it's even scarier to move to a town that you have almost zero association with. And meanwhile, on the other side, the community side of things, we don't have welcome wagons like we used to. The post office can't just hand out a list of all the newcomers, right? What type of welcoming experience do people have is the number one question we have out of this. And Neil's going to talk about that in just a minute here. The last piece I want to talk about here is over 14% of our rural households had one or both workers telecommuting, and this was pre-pandemic. So again, these trends, I want to remind you, all of these trends are pre-pandemic. A desire for rural living, people are telecommuting, they're moving for all these kind of move factors that are not related to a job. And really, it kind of gets back to my basic question here. If rural communities are dying, then why can't I find a house to buy? And so the point here is we live in these really big, large regional communities. Instead of saying that we live in the middle of nowhere, like I like to play on the words here and say we like to live in the middle of everywhere. And there are some implications here. Number one is that, just as an example here, so I know I didn't grab like one of your county data, but I just want to remind you that a lot of the times we have to do our work within jurisdictional boundaries that don't really make sense anymore, right? So like county boundaries, okay, like they make sense for some things, but ultimately my point is county boundaries were drawn during the time of horse and buggy. And when you look at how actually people move in and out and across landscapes, they don't reflect county boundaries. So for example, here's Fillmore County in southeastern Minnesota. Every day, 1,800 people commute into the county from outside the county. And every day, 5,000 people commute out to work, probably mostly in La Crosse and Winona, right, in southeastern Minnesota. And 2,500 people both live and work. So residence is becoming decoupled from employment decisions. But I want to ask you this question, like I sat on our chamber board in Stevens County for a long time, like, and when we would do visioning, or when you do community visioning, do you include the people that commute in every day? Or do you only include the people that just live there? Because typically when I've done community facilitated, like community development activities where you're doing visioning and project activity, you only include the people that work there, or only the people that live there, right? So I think we have to be aware of these kinds of trends, of movements of people across the countryside, that ultimately those 1,800 people that commute into Fillmore every day, they love Fillmore County too. And they consider this kind of their home as well. When they're working there, they're spending 8 to 12 hours a day there every day. But when it comes to planning for inside the county, we're only going to include people that live there. I'm not saying they do that. I'm just saying these are the implications that we think about when we think about the fact that people don't just live and work and shop and play in one place. So we do this exercise. And if you'd like me to make up an exercise for you and your community, I can certainly do this. But what we do is, it's very simple. Basically, we take a map of a region and we ask people to put a star where you live and an X where you work, and then draw a circle around how far you go to shop and eat out, and then a circle around how far do you go to play and recreate. So here's an example. My wife and I, we lived in Hancock. I was there for 12 years. And so I would live in Morris, right? So my home is in Hancock and I worked in Morris. Simple. Now, how far did we go out to shop and eat out during the course of the last year, right? We go up to Fergus and Battle Lake and Alec and St. Cloud and Sauk and Wilmer and Benson. Like, we wouldn't just only eat at Buddy's Bar and Grill in Hancock because, like, it was good, but I didn't want to eat at Buddy's every day, right? So we this was part and parcel of rural people live in vastly wide landscapes, essentially. So now when we ask people to identify where they shop and eat out, you draw one boundary, and now draw another boundary around how far do you go to play and recreate? And now it's even bigger. And now it's how far to the lakes up by, we got colleagues, Ryan Pesh, like, I'm going up the lakes by his place up here. I'm going over to Brainerd. I'm still going over to St. Cloud. Now I'm going over to Ortonville and Big Stone, right? When now you start to look at how do you market your place when nobody lives and works and shops and plays in just your place. Like, even with folks that like live in Wilmer, like, they're still going out of Wilmer into the region to recreate and play. So what does this mean? What are the implications here when we're trying to do planning, when we're trying to offer support for the community? And we call it the rural life shed. And that really, no town is a one-stop shop. Between your home and your work is 30 to 45 minutes. You all know this, right? Between your home and how far you go to eat and shop is up to 60 minutes. And then between home and play, you're getting up to 2 hours away. So what does this mean? I just say we live in the middle of everywhere, but how do we, as local leaders, then make local decisions, like within our jurisdictions of cities and counties, while at the same time respecting the reality of people's lives, right? So for us, the region is the primary unit of interest. So if you're an HR person and you're trying to recruit a new employee in, and all you're doing is showing them your shop floor and your salary and benefits, that's not enough. We have to do more than help people envision what their job is going to be like in our rural communities. We have to show them what their life is going to be like in these rural communities. So then, just one final example here, like, if I'm the mayor of Hancock, right? And somebody, and Neil comes up and he's like, hey, Mr. Mayor, I like your town. I'm looking to move to Hancock. And I say, oh, Hancock's great, right? We got Buddy's Bar and Grill. We have a full K-12 school. We got our C-store / car sales / deli / haircutter on the corner. Like, you're going to love this place. And then Neil's like, yeah, I do like Hancock, but I'm also looking at moving to Starbuck, right? And then if we're really parochial about this, I'd be like, oh, you don't want to move to Starbuck. They got nothing going on there. Hancock is where it's at. Well, now what did you just do? Not only did I downplay Starbuck, but I downplayed myself. If I can't name off things that people might enjoy in the region and around me, I really am living in the middle of nowhere. So as we go to recruit people, we have to acknowledge the reality of people's lives. So we've started work around a model of what we call resident recruitment. And this parallels industrial recruitment, but it's really it's aspects of community development, economic development, and tourism. So with that, I'm going to invite Neil to take over here.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, and so just so you all know, a lot of times what has happened is Ben has given a presentation about these trends, and then people have said, now what do we do? So what are our next steps? And I've had the pleasure and the privilege to work with a lot of community members and leaders from cities and chambers and community foundations across Minnesota as they try to address what's next. How do we work on the implications of the things that Ben just shared? And I'd like to talk to you about some of the themes that we see in that work and some of the options that you might have in your community. So you can advance, Ben. I'm going to try to put these options into some buckets for you and talk a little bit about each of them. But I'm going to spend the most time on some welcoming initiatives that I think are really critical today, and I'll explain why. But the first set of initiatives that I think you have that you can think about, these are pretty low cost and easy to do. Maybe you've done some in your community. These types of things are called invitation activities. So this is, you know that there are newcomers in your community. Ben just told you. You probably know this too, though. How do you engage those folks? How do you invite them to participate and be a member of the community? Or conversely, if you know that you would like to recruit people or people are interested in joining your community, moving to your community, how do you put your shingle out there? How do you let them know that there's something interesting here? And these can be described as invitation activities. Some folks have taken their lists of class reunions from their high schools, and they send out little notes to folks saying, hey, there's houses for sale, there are things to do, consider coming back. Others have taken a look at their tourism locations, and on that board where there's all those flyers and pamphlets that says, here are the things to do when you visit here, they've thought a little bit further and said, here are the houses for sale here. You could live here, to try to capture some of those folks that are already interested and have already stopped by. There are also little networks that already exist out there of existing residents that you can tap into. So just one example of that might be putting a note that you're having some sort of event for people that are new to the community in the, here would be the Sauk Center Sell It site on Facebook. So the community Sell It site, or other locations where people are already getting together. But the idea is these are activities to just set that invitation. You're welcome to come and move to our community, and we're expecting that you'd like to. Ben, you can advance it. If you go another step further, what we see are there are also more broad civic engagement activities where it's more than just a one-time welcome or invitation, but it's more of a consistent pattern of events and activities that are really focused and crafted to help newcomers become part of the community, to feel welcome and to feel like they are part of the narrative of the community and that their story is valuable. And I'll give you some explanations in the next slide of some of the things that we're seeing across the state. Go ahead, Ben. So across Minnesota, and I just saw in the chat box that I'll have to add one for St. Cloud's newcomer service, which is exciting for me. Across Minnesota, we have this variety of recruitment efforts that are civic engagement and a mix of marketing efforts as well, to let people know what is going on in the community, how you can become a part of the community and contribute to the community, but also just to more broadly get the story of the community out there. And we have some examples from some nearby places here, like Otter Tail County, which is doing a lot of work around really bringing people together around a program called the Grab-A-Bite program, or the Rural Rejuvenation. Oh, shoot, I think I get the name wrong. Rural Rebound, sorry, the Rural Rebound. And then we also have a marketing effort called Live Wide Open that really focuses on a high level sharing stories of newcomers, and also the assets of the communities within the region, so that if you are interested in the region, you're interested in one of the communities, that there's some really high, nicely produced products to use that can be exciting to you and help you understand this place that you're considering moving to. And one of the other areas is one that kind of blends all of these. It's called Fairmont Area Life, where people in Fairmont are also doing that marketing and promotion piece, but they've built more of a service. So when you are moving to Fairmont, they're ready to show you around town. They are ready to help you move in that first week, that first month, that first year. There's events called Neighbors and Newcomers that you can regularly go to and attend and meet other people that are new to the community, as well as people that have decided to that they're willing to be guides to newcomers. So the next slide here is just an example from what Live Wide Open looks like. And Ben, we'll just keep going to the next slide. So there's this other side and set of events or activities that we would call welcoming activities. And they're slightly different from the marketing side. They're slightly different from the simple invitation to move here. They're really focusing on when folks have moved and decided to live in a community, how are they embraced and engaged to participate. And I already shared the Grab a Bite program. This is in Otter Tail County. This idea is, let's get 12 to 15 community champions that will commit to bringing a newcomer, whoever that is, newcomer to the community, taking them out to lunch, not having them pay for it, and not having them join any association or group that they're part of, just getting to know them and having a conversation. Some folks might still even have the welcome wagon, but we're seeing sort of a rejuvenation of that in small communities there, where they're saying, let's at least have some sort of welcome packet, or let's have one person who will knock on the door and say hello and welcome to the community. And then I know one of the things that's, I think, the easiest $300 you can spend in a small community is to hold an event like a newcomer supper, where maybe once or twice a year you invite new people to the community to have supper together and have them get up and introduce themselves and talk about why they decided to live there. I know I participated in an event like that in the community of Clarkfield, and it was a really great way to make friends that lasted more than a decade. I want to spend the rest of my time, though, talking about a more broad initiative called the Welcoming Communities Project that I've been a part of in southern Minnesota. And the goals of this project really focused on how do we help individuals, leaders, much like yourself, build the capacity to respond to local community needs around welcoming and around demographic changes. How we can spend time learning about what it's like to be a small community and a rural community, and then share the ways and the practices that we're putting into place to make our place more inclusive and equitable for all people that move to the community. Go ahead, Ben. And one more, we'll see. So we designed this cohort program a couple of years ago, where we brought together people from 5 communities, and we learned together once a month around topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and welcoming. We also brought those communities together in something that we created as in our team called the Rural Equity Summit, so we could connect even more broadly across not just those 5 communities, but others that had taken on this, taken on the mantle of, we would like to welcome people, and we would like that to be inclusive and delightful. And then we've developed assessments to help people gauge their readiness around this work. Go ahead, Ben. One thing that, if you're interested in getting involved in this, that I've learned is that no one group or organization is likely going to have the needed assets and resources on their own to do something that is broadly representing the community and that can welcome everyone. We all have our own networks in our organizations, and we all have our own lenses that we see the world through. And in our case, with this Welcoming Communities project, we had partners that included the Region 9 Development Commission, the Mankato Diversity Council, the Blandin Foundation, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Bush Foundation, the McKnight Foundation, University of Minnesota Extension, the cities of St. James, St. Peter, Waseca. The list keeps going on. And what we found is that sometimes we needed financial resources, sometimes we needed the different understanding of what it's like to be part of this community to be brought to the table, and the different skills and abilities of all of our partners to actually be able to do something that was really going to be meaningful. Go ahead, Ben. And here's just a little history, and I won't go into every point here, but I'll just say that sometimes the question is, how do we start work like you've been doing in this Welcoming Communities partnership? And I think for many of you involved in community foundations, you know that it doesn't always start with the grand plan that has 64 points that's detailed into multiple sub-levels of activity and tactics. Sometimes it just starts with a conversation or one of your trusted friends and allies saying, this is really important. And in Southern Minnesota, that's how this project started. It was several commissioners saying, hey, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make a community that is welcoming and inclusive to all people, and that people want to live here, and that once they move here, they don't feel isolated and alone and like they're not part of the genuine story of this place. And from that, we built. And I think that's the story that many of you maybe have experienced in your community practice as well, is that we start where we can and then we build. Go ahead, Ben. So I mentioned we put together some assessments when we launched our second round of this programming to welcome new residents and address issues of inclusion. And this assessment helped us understand in Brown County where were the social sectors in the community that were already ready to go. Like they are advanced in their practice of talking about inclusion and equity and diversity. And where are the sectors that maybe are a little behind and would like to get further along? So we worked on this assessment to help calibrate that, help understand where and appreciate how our community was doing in each of Sleepy Eye, Springfield, and New Ulm. And then we, for the past year, have been working with those three communities over Zoom and flexing to meet their needs. I'm so happy to report some of the things that have happened even in just that short time and in the midst of the pandemic. For instance, Springfield, their community group, they started a welcoming committee as officially part of their city government. And I think they're on the path toward forming a human rights commission, and our folks in New Ulm that are participating have really ramped up their efforts with the partnership of the Human Rights Commission. And I'll move on just one more slide here, and want to say one of the broader things that we did this past year to share stories and to help people in communities all across the state understand how can we address topics of equity. And I keep coming back to this because I think equity is a part of welcoming, and having a commitment to making your community an accessible place that everyone feels like they can be a part of, that no one feels on the outside of, is a commitment. And unfortunately, there's not a specific point-by-point checklist that you can take to learn about that. So what we feel strongly about is that one of the best ways to learn about this very complicated topic is to come together and to hear the stories and to interact with each other through things like our Rural Equity Summit and other online events that we're seeing more and more, and like the one we have here today. Go ahead, Ben. So just my final thing to mention here is that there have been some resources that if you're really specifically interested in the welcoming side, that you can check out. One is a toolkit called the Welcoming Communities Toolkit that was created by a graduate student here at the University of Minnesota. And then there's an organization called Welcoming America that is working very hard, specifically on the welcoming side of the newcomer experience. And if you're interested, if you're working on either welcoming or resident recruitment, I do host a regular monthly meeting of people that are doing that type of work across the state. And actually just before this, we were meeting and talking about the work that we do. So please do just reach out and let me know, because I'm happy to let you join in those meetings and share your story and experience. Go ahead, Ben.
Super, thanks, Neil. So really kind of related, I've been working a lot more with philanthropy and community foundations over the past 3, 4, 5 years here. And I think one of the key points that we've got is still about the narrative, right? And I guess the key point that we've come to with our foundation, with the foundation world, is because a lot of times foundations are fairly new into doing proactive economic development, housing, right? Typically 30 years ago, foundations were completely reactive. We're not involved in community as a community change agent to the extent they are today. But really, when we talk about the narrative too, I just want to remind you that as a community foundation, is if, basically we want to fund and support some of the struggles that we've got in our community, but if that's all you fund, then that's all the community defines itself as. If all you fund is problems, then all the community defines itself as a big problem. So I think we have to be very careful here in how we try to support and work on some of the things that we've got in our rural communities, because again, narrative matters. Narrative can be inhibitive. Narrative, I would argue that the negative rural narrative today inhibits most migration decisions that people would have to even look to our rural communities. So again, I think here the philanthropy world has a very good window into understanding the dynamics around change, being able to be proactive in that, and actually allocate resources toward that narrative writing activity. So really, I think, again, you can be proactive today as opposed to responding to change. But part of that too is getting all of our boards and getting our residents up to speed on how to do that work in a reasonable way. So in many ways, you as organizations, you're building partnerships that didn't exist before. A lot of times you're engaging the community in a way that you had not been able to do so previously, and actually leading conversations about the future, rather than just supporting efforts that may have hopefully existed in our rural communities before that. So why is this important? I think, overall, we talk about programs that we run in our communities. I've got a colleague of mine, Randy Cantrell in Nebraska. We comically say that, we rename our community development programs every 10 years. But the key point is we get people together and get them to interact. And if we can do that in kind of a structured way to ensure people are kind and respectful, we ultimately see a lot of really great outcomes come out of that. But I want to remind you that rural communities are a desirable place. Here's a study from even 12 years ago, when Americans were asked, like, if you could choose wherever you wanted to live, Americans, and we know that 80% of you live in the city and 20% of you live in the rural places or small towns. If you could pick anywhere to live, where would you live? 51% of Americans 12 years ago said they'd prefer live in small towns and rural places. So this demand for rural living has been there. I would argue today it's stopped up. And why is it stopped up? It's this one thing. I'm going to argue it's this one thing. And after you hear me say this, you can't say you don't see this coming. And that is today, 30% of our rural homeowners are over the age of 70, and another 40 to 45% are baby boomers, i.e., 75% of our homes are going to turn over in the next 15 to 20 years. This is unprecedented in the history of rural America in terms of turnover. But right now, when I hear the term workforce housing shortage, my common response is, I don't think we have a workforce housing shortage. We have plenty of workforce housing. It's currently occupied by our seniors, i.e. the people over the age of 70. And these folks in that oldest age categories are staying in their homes longer than any previous generation at that age. they're staying in their home. So it's one thing to say like, oh, I want to welcome new people in, but it's hard to welcome new people in if you literally have nowhere for them to live. So with that, we've got a lot of work to do as we look forward to our small towns and rural places, but just want to thank you for the opportunity to share our research here with you today. I've got my email on here too. If you want to get a hold of Neil, I can get that with you too. Holly, you asked a question early on about what is rural. Rural does have some very concrete definitions by the census in terms of like population thresholds of around over, it's going to potentially change right now. There's a lot of changes afoot. But it is generally over, you get a certain population threshold, but you also have a commuting interaction. That when you've got a high commuting interaction with another central core county like Hennepin or Ramsey, you're considered part of that metropolitan area. So even if you have people that live in small towns like Forest Lake, like they're considered urban because the majority of those people are still commuting in to that urban center. But in many ways, rural is not something that's defined by what it is. Rural is defined by something it isn't. Rural is a residual category after urbanity gets defined. It's historically been that way. So I think there are very few ways to actively describe it, but more we react to when people say, well, the city is this, and then everything else is not the city. So with that.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. I appreciate that because it seems to always be, it's always my question. Yeah. And I know it's not as clear cut as, just rural and urban and numbers. So I appreciate that. I have a couple more questions. Looks like, let's hang on just a second. There's a question here and I'll ask their question before mine. So here's a question. Do we see a big percentage of people coming back to a rural community after conducting the marketing strategies? Some of the things that you mentioned, Neil, to bring them back. Are we seeing a significant increase due to the marketing? That was actually one of my questions as well.
Yeah, we haven't done a full-on research project around outcomes from these programs, but I will say that, for example, in Otter Tail County, where they had pieced together some money to hire, they had really the nation's first rural recruitment coordinator in Otter Tail County, and they pieced together funds to do this. Well, after 2 years, the county dedicated that fund full time. So that for me is like, they must see something in terms of outcomes, or the county, especially county commissioners, they don't like giving away money, right? So like, I really think they must have seen some strategies and some outcomes there, but we don't have a formal outcome, a way to measure this, because all of those organizations on the map all use different strategies for how they get there. And we're kind of okay with that. We're not saying like there's only one way forward, right? So so some do communications, some do marketing, some do digital media and advertising, some do branding. So I think there's a variety. That's but I'll leave Neil to answer some more of this here.
Sure.
Sure.
I'm curious. Go ahead, Neil. Go ahead.
Oh, so let's say you're a community of under 1,000 people. And you've taken some efforts to make it easier to find out what it's like to live here, promote the opportunities, and then you've done some of those welcoming activities. In a community of under 1,000, 3 to 4 families moving in can make all the difference in that local school. It's so on the community level. Sometimes the evaluation isn't that complicated. It's just asking people, what was it like, and following up. But as we get into some of the larger communities in greater Minnesota, there have been sophisticated efforts that are underway to track the marketing returns and to see what difference it makes. Some of those are kind of the web metrics like click-throughs, and did they get, we put up this geo fence thing, and did it mean a click to the website that we wanted, and did we get a phone call? And the folks that are pretty sophisticated and have been at this a while are tracking those types of things. Mm-hmm. But in the end, a lot of times it's a complex mix of these sorts of activities to explain why you would want to live here and that you can be a part of this community, and the final decision. It's a lot on the marketing side. It's kind of the perennial question: does this advertising make any difference or not? But on the welcoming side, we know it does, because people show up and they can tell you, I do feel welcome, or I don't, or I'm glad that we're finally talking about this.
Mhm.
Well, and I'll just pile on to this a little bit in a sense, like you can even have local people achieve outcomes too. Like you can have kids saying like, this might actually be someplace I can come back to, where I didn't think I could before. I thought there was nothing here for me, but now through this, I see there is.
Mhm.
Narrative matters. I think understanding how the narrative changes is much more difficult to track, but is even more important in trying to allure people to our rural communities. So for example, like Wichita, Kansas has a remote worker program where they'll pay $10,000 to $15,000 for a remote worker that moves to Wichita. Now, we're not, when I talk to the folks there, they're less interested in the numbers, like how many people do it, and more about how many people are actually considering it. How many people have turned their attention to Wichita or to a rural place? Because if you're from New York City, everything in between Chicago and the West Coast is rural. Like all of Des Moines, that's all rural. Like Minneapolis, like that's all rural. Like, so if you can get people to turn their attention in a way that they had never been able to do that before, that's a win too. But that, you know, I mean, I'm an evaluation expert, and that's just how do you measure? How do you start collecting data on some of that?
Right. I'm curious too, just a little spin off of that. So were you involved in those initiatives, or are those community and county-wide, region-wide initiatives that took off on their own? Did you provide resources for that?
We've had a mix of participation in those. So many of those on the map, those popped up on their own. That's the organic seeing this need and doing that. And then there are several projects that we've had some programming to help spur that kind of activity with some of our extension program in an effort we call Making It Home, to help people learn from those early adopters of this kind of work. And it's now we're bringing them together, and they meet and they share the activities.
Yeah, I'll say the Get Rural program in Western Minnesota was the very first one, and they initially were partners in the very first research of our interviews and focus groups with newcomers. But then on the other side, like the Fairmont Area Life, I had just presented one like Thursday night, you know, and then there was a city council meeting on Monday, and they allocated $5,000 toward a brain gain effort and said, what can you do for us? And at the time I was like, we don't have anything. Like we don't actually have any programming here. I'm doing the applied research, right? So ultimately they did their own thing. They parted out part of their position and dedicated some effort toward it. And just once you had a person thinking about it all the time, you tend to see things happen. Yeah,
sure. And the champions that I think you mentioned as well. So having the community champions. I've got a couple more quick questions. Hopefully we can get through here. One of them is, will broadband expansion increase telecommuting, in your opinion? Either one of you.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just say on the rural narrative piece on broadband though, not all rural communities are behind the 8 ball. My internet in Hancock, I live in St. Cloud now. My internet in Hancock was faster than the internet I'll ever have in St. Cloud. Many rural communities have fiber to the farm in many places. And why? It's because we have a strong co-op structure here in Minnesota that actually made those investments in fiber years ago. So while some communities may not have fiber and broadband and the whole digital divide, that doesn't mean all of rural Minnesota is quote unquote behind. I'll just say.
I'll just add something to that. Maybe 15 years ago, you were standing out because you had fiber and really great internet. Today, if you don't, it's weird. That's what we hear from newcomers. That's what when people are looking at this, like, what do you mean dial-up? I don't even understand what you're talking about. I can't watch Netflix here, then I can't live here. I mean, I think the expectation of being able to access the internet wherever you are here in the United States is not going away, and it shouldn't be seen as an extra bonus feature.
There's a question in the Q&A there too. Oh,
there's one more question. I think this will have to be our last one. So for either one of you, what are the keys to success in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in rural areas where few non-white people live, but more are actually moving to?
Yeah, this is so working in southern Minnesota in that project that I described, that many of the communities there, if we look at the demographic profile, more than 90% of the people that live there would identify as white. And, you know, so there are communities across the state, our landscape that don't have that composition. Like if we look at Worthington or Wilmer, there's just, it's a more diverse place, both culturally and racially. And so that means that there's more interactions, there's more demand for this kind of thing to happen, where we're addressing this. And in our smaller communities, that hasn't always been the case. It's been broadly, white people, like you said. But in this project that we're doing, part of what our mission is to find people from all walks of life, and really make an effort to talk to people in the BIPOC community that are living there. They're there. Like, it might just be a few folks or a few families, but they're in your community, and they're part of it. But our structures of social interaction don't always overlap. Mm-hmm. And so some of that work that we do is just inviting people to a space that allows that kind of inclusion and diversity, and making that a space that we can talk about what it's like, and talk about how it could be better, and design what the future should look like here in this place. Mm-hmm. And just one of those things that is really critical in that work, if you are listening today and you want to do that, is building the trust and relationships you need to do. Whether you want to build the trust and new relationships with white people in your community, or if it's the opposite way, that takes time. But then that commitment to making sure all of your communications are really in the language, and both the specific language, but also the language of your participants in terms of lived experience, and being ready to follow up with people and talk with them. It's so critical, and it's such an easy thing to say. We know that in our community of St. James, that we have a lot of people that speak Spanish only. Why would we just put stuff out in English? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the base level of work that we need to do. And I think that if you're looking for a place to start, just taking a hard look at any of your communications materials for existing community events is a way to build in that, and then reaching out to folks who may have never had a call.
That's great. Thanks so much. We're running out of time. I think I'll turn it over to Steve, but I'd really like to thank Ben and Neil for presenting today. Fascinating, just always good to hear what you're doing, and great work. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap up, I guess. And thanks everyone for attending today.
Great. Well, thank you. And what a wonderful presentation, Neil and Ben. Thank you so much for the great work you do, and what great advocates you are for Greater Minnesota, and in particular for the rural narrative. Just really appreciate your work, and know that we're allies in supporting that, and appreciate your feedback and helping us all understand this in greater detail. So thanks so much for being with us today. And for everybody who's online, thank you for joining us. These Community Connection webinars will be continuing. We're doing one a month. And our next Community Connections webinar will actually be on April 13th. And that topic will be Conversations That Matter. A woman, Joni Nielsen from Alexandria, has really been working hard to bring their community together to have some very challenging and difficult conversations, in particular around diversity, equity, inclusion. And we're going to be featuring her and her work coming up on April 13th. Also, if you are interested, we also do a webinar series focused with professional advisors, and talk about some of the services offered through community foundations. And the topic that we're going to explore on March 25th is corporate advised funds. Many corporations and even small businesses who want to give back to their local communities have found a way to partner with their local community foundation with setting up corporate advised funds. So that will be covered on Thursday, March 25th. As always, we welcome your feedback, your input. Please contact us at info@communitygiving.org. Thank you so much for the great work you do in your local community, and join us next time on April 13th for our next Community Connections webinar. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.